Look at this building. 3 floors in Chicago, late 1800s, right before the World's Fair. And depending on who tells their story, it's either a simple building or a maze with only one ending. People call it the Murder Castle, a hotel where doors open into brick walls, hallways that goes nowhere, rooms that were made to never let you out, and the center of all of that was H. Holmes, a man who called himself a doctor, and he has turned this building into a machine. But here, where it gets strange. When detectives finally search the building, it doesn't behave like a building. They reveal furnaces, acid vats, a chute that drops straight into the basement. This wasn't just a hotel, it was something engineered. So the question isn't just what happened inside these walls. It is, how did dozens of people walk in but never walked out? But before the Birdo Castle, the headlines, and even the confessions, there was just a boy named Herman Webster Mudgett, born May 16th, 1861, in Clementon, New Hampshire. And if you're looking for a dramatic origin story, something that explains everything, the records don't really offer one. Descriptions from that time call him intelligent, observant, and drawn to medicine. Yes, there are stories of animal experiments, stripping behavior, but most of these accounts get louder decades later. So instead of myth, we're going to track the pattern. Because the pattern is worse. At 17, he marries Clara Lovering. They have a son. From the outside, this looks like a normal family. However, there's something inside of him that is obscure. Herman doesn't end the marriage. He doesn't file for divorce. He just leaves. And that choice, walking away instead of resolving things, becomes a pattern. He enrolls at the University of Michigan Medical School, graduating in 1884. In the 1800s, medical students worked with dead bodies. Insurance systems were loose, and records keeping was fragmented. There are repeated allegations that Holmes turned some of these deaths into insurance schemes. He would take out life insurance policies, sometimes on associates or under an alias. Then he staged accidents, filed the paperwork, and used another body. On paper, the death looked legitimate. And then the payout followed. Whether every story is true isn't the point, but the pattern is. He learns how to use bodies without killing them to make money. That's where things started to change, not with violence, but with paper. The real horror of H. Holmes isn't the castle, it's how he learned to control documentation, and how that led him into control life and death. After graduation, he doesn't just settle down, he drifts. New towns, new jobs, new lies. Pills left behind, people left behind. Then in 1886, he validated the lie. He leaves New Hampshire and heads to Chicago, introducing himself as Henry Howard Holmes. And in the late 1800s, the kind of reinvention wasn't unusual. Identity wasn't centralized, and records stayed local. Once you left a town, the paper trail usually stopped there. And this time, if you said you were a doctor and you had the paperwork to back it up, people believed you. And Chicago was the perfect place to try it. The city was exploding, the population was growing, and construction was everywhere. Holmes saw what a rapid growth creates: confusion, oversight gaps, and opportunity. And what he builds next, that's where the legend really begins. Holmes settles in Inglewood, works at a pharmacy, and eventually becomes the owner. Across the street, he buys property, builds 3 stories, storefronts below, and rooms above. Later, newspaper will call it the murder castle. But here's where we slow down. Because the castle you have seen in documentaries with gas chambers and conveyor belts, that version largely explodes after his arrest. Yes, obviously the building had hidden spaces, including odd hallways, soundproofed rooms, and a basement furnace. But there's no solid proof of industrialized killing chambers. And this matters. Because the truth is actually more disturbing. The building wasn't just an architecture, it was an instrument. And within it, people began disappearing. It starts quietly, not with tourists, not with strangers, but with someone who trusted him. Julia Connor works in the pharmacy. She married to one of Holmes' employees and has a daughter, Pearl. Holmes begins an affair with her, giving her private reassurances and promises. Soon, Julia's marriage collapses. Her husband leaves, she stays. Now she's alone, working for Holmes, living in the building that he controls. By late 1891, she's pregnant. Holmes tells people he plans to marry her, but then in December, Julia and her daughter Pearl vanished. Holmes gives explanations. She moved, or she died during an abortion, or she went away unexpectedly. But there's no record of her leaving Chicago. No confirmed burial, no letters, nothing definitive. But enough to ask a question. If Julia never left the building, where did she go? And Pearl, 12 years old, disappeared with her. That's the first moment the building feels less like a business. A year later, another woman walks in. Emmeline Sigrand, young, educated, and professional. She becomes his secretary. He proposes marriage again. To colleagues, he speaks as if the wedding is inevitable. To Emmeline, that offers stability. Then in 1892, she's gone. Holmes tells the people that she returned home. Then he says she traveled abroad. Then she married someone else. Different versions, same endings, same silence as well. No one hears from her ever again. And as we can see, Holmes doesn't explode in violence. He absorbs people, then erases them. By 1893, Holmes wasn't just manipulating feelings no more. He started getting money. Minnie Williams arrives in Chicago from Texas. She isn't random. She has something Holmes wants. Property and inheritance. Holmes starts spending time with her. He flatters her, gives her attention as well, talks about marriage and a future together. And this time, they did. They get married, and over time, Minnie transfers her property into his name. Lands that once belonged to her now legally belongs to him. And once that is done, the same cycle starts. She disappears, no goodbye, no confirmed sighting after, and no letters. Then her sister Nanny comes to Chicago, looking for her, and that's the last confirmed trace of her too. She disappears inside the same building. And this is where we need to stop. Because to understand what happened to these women, we have to understand the building itself. From the street, the first floor looked normal, with a pharmacy containing shelves full of medicine, perfume bottles, and cosmetics, with customers walking in and out of the building. This is how he earned people's trust and hid in plain sight. Next to it were other stores, a jewelry counter, retail spaces, small businesses, offices. To anyone visiting Chicago in 1893, it looked respectable, legitimate, and busy. Nothing about the ground floor suggested danger, but the second floor, that's where things changed. Upstairs were guest rooms, boarding rooms, furnished bedrooms rented to visitors and tenants, but some had gas lines installed directly into the rooms. And here's where it gets unsettling. Some doors could lock from the outside, some rooms had no windows. There is even a room that had thick insulation and a heavy door, designed in a way that any sound coming from that room would be muffled. There were no confirmed torture devices, no splitting blades, and nothing like movie-style traps. But control, yes, there was control of light, sound, and air. Investigators later described hallways that led nowhere, doors that opened into brick walls, staircases that stopped halfway. This type of architecture was not used for torture, but for confusing and disorienting people that entered the building. If someone screamed, would anyone know where it came from? The building also had chute-like shafts, which basically are vertical passages between floors, which some believed was used to drop the bodies from the upper floors to the basement. But where these chutes were exactly located, no one knows. But what is confirmed is the basement, because that's where the strongest physical evidence was found. Down in the basement, there was a large industrial furnace, big enough to burn more than just trash. Right beside it is what appears to be a makeshift lab, set up with a surgical table, dissection tools, and chemical containers. Barrels of quicklime are stacked in the corner. It is substance known to speed decomposition. There are also large vats used for chemical storage, and built into the floor are drainage pits. At this point, the picture starts to change, because this wasn't just a building where people disappeared, it was a place that was designed for containment, control, and disposal. There were no conveyor belts or dungeon theatrics, just a doctor with privacy, chemicals, fire, and time. What makes this even more disturbing is that no one actually knows what's inside the building. Not yet, because during the construction, Holmes rotates contractors constantly. Not a single crew sees the full layout, and the few people who get too close disappear. So the disappearances don't lead to an arrest. Because in the 1890s, people move, communication is slow, records don't connect between states, and Holmes understands something critical. If you remove the body and you write the paperwork, you control the outcome. He isn't chaotic, he is cunning. He chooses women who trusts him, who are isolated and who depends on him financially. He doesn't need a dungeon, he needs obedience and trust. And for years that worked. But eventually he tries something riskier. Instead of letting something quietly disappear, he tries to turn a death into a payout. At this time, there has to be a body. And once there is a body, there is a trail. And that trail begins with a man named Benjamin Pitezel. 1894, Holmes starts a partnership with Benjamin Pitezel. They were planning an insurance fraud, a $10,000 life insurance policy, equivalent to over $385,000 today. The idea is to simply stage a death and then claim the payout. But in September 1894, Pitezel is found dead in Philadelphia. Holmes is later convicted of his murder, and this is where the story turns from manipulation to undeniable horror. Holmes doesn't run. He approaches Pitzel's wife, offers reassurances, control, and solutions, and then he takes custody of the three children, Alice, Neely, and Howard. He moves them city to city, hotels, different names, rental homes, nothing dramatic, and nothing that draws attention. Again, paperwork. Then Detective Frank Geyer enters. He follows the paper trail left behind. Other registers, train logs, and rental agreements. Then in July 1895, the paper trail led Frank to Toronto, where he finds Alice and Neely buried in a cellar. Later, the paper trail led him into Indiana, where remains were found with traces of Howard's DNA. This is when someone finally understood what he was doing and how far he would go to not get caught. And then on November 17, 1894, in Boston, the investigation finally catches up to him. Holmes is arrested, and within months, he's in Philadelphia courtroom facing trial. He's convicted for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel and sentenced to death. He was not convicted for the castle and not for the other 100 speculated victims that entered the building, only for one proven murder. But before his execution, Holmes confesses to 27 killings. When investigators search the building, including the basement, they recover bones. And there are signs of chemical processings that were later linked to Julia and her daughter, Pearl. They also find hair and bone fragments believed to belong to Emmeline. One witness tells the police they saw Holmes and a janitor carrying a heavy trunk out of the building the day after she vanished. And then the discoveries get more bizarre. Minnie's watch chain and Nanny's garter buckle. They were both recovered from one of the building's ovens. There were no elaborate traps, no hidden torture chambers, just fragments. Personal belongings that survived the heat, but even during his confession, he lies. Because some named victims are later found alive, which makes it impossible to understand what was going on inside of his head. His death sentence was carried out of Moyamensing prison, but before that he requested to be buried 10 feet deep in concrete. Even in death, he states his own terms. Even though he died, the story didn't, because the murder castle turned him into a legend, a building you can barely imagine, a monster who drew every corner and controlled every part of it. But Holmes wasn't unstoppable because he was supernatural. He lasted because the world around him wasn't built to connect the dots fast enough. People still tried to keep the story open. What if he escaped? And what if he faked the hanging? What if there was a reason behind his last wish? But in 2017, his grave was open. The remains were examined, and investigators reported strong confirmation that the body was his, closing the door on that version of the story. The uncomfortable part is this: how many people like Holmes are hiding in plain sight? Not because they are brilliant, but because the system isn't built to catch them in time. Holmes is dead. The system that let him exist isn't.